From Nordic Institute and the Sault Ste. Marie Innovation Centre's Rural Agri-Innovation Network, we are committed to promoting resilient Northern Ontario communities. Over the years, we have built local economies, attracted young people to education and employment opportunities, and bridged the gaps between communities, funders, and leaders. Now we are partnering to bring you a brand new podcast series, the Packsack Project. If you have ever packed for a trail hike, you may have thought, did I really need to pack this expensive camera gear? What is essential to this trip? The Packsack Project is all about exploring the essential relationships, attitudes, and mindsets that Northern communities need as we adapt to change and challenges. Every week, join Sean Meadis, David Thompson, and Gail Broad as we share stories of Northern, Indigenous, and rural communities, exploring ways we adapt for improving people's lives and the environment. We will uncover what Northern communities need in order to achieve their goals by sharing real-life stories, experiences, and examples. The journey is not linear, and we will examine how different efforts lay a foundation for the future. Building stronger communities may require a change in perspective, attitude, partnerships, and alliances along the way, and you will gain the knowledge to be the change you wish to see in your own community. Without further ado, let me introduce you to today's host, David Thompson, as he examines the impact of sandhill cranes on agriculture in Northern Ontario.
On the program today, we're going to talk about sandhill cranes. The crane can grow to be 4 feet tall, and it can have a 7-foot wingspan. They're an ancient bird, as a 10 million year old fossil from the US is said to be of their species, maybe from a prehistoric relative. It must have been a descendant of pterodactyls with its long neck, long legs, broad wings, and a 6-inch beak. You can tell how old they are from the color, as adults will have pale cheeks and red over their eyes. The cranes eat grain, seeds, and worms on farms, grasslands, and marshes across Canada and the United States. Every year you can count hundreds of cranes in a field in September as they feast on grain and corn in different parts of Northern Ontario. Over the years, there have been organizations that have said there should be more done to control the impacts of the cranes on agriculture. I heard it was a problem for anyone growing any grain crops in the area where these birds would come through like combines to eat the grain. I sought to find out more about sandhill cranes, what impact they have, what farmers are doing about it, and if there is any way we can harmoniously live with cranes. Over a few episodes, I'll be speaking with a variety of community members and a researcher to hear about their perspectives on the impact that cranes have had and are currently having. Through this dialogue, we'll explore the strategies that researchers and farmers have come up with to mitigate their impacts, and along the way, we'll get a better understanding of the crane's larger impact on the region and the people who call it home. On today's episode, we'll hear a story from Chief Dean Sayers, Batchewana First Nation in Algoma, and how that community took shape through leaders of the Crane clan. Next, we will hear from Chris Sharp, a biologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, who tracks crane movement and behaviors to get a better idea of how to mitigate their impact. And finally, you will hear from farmer Justin Gaudet of Valley Growers Farm in Sudbury, and the first-hand experiences he's had with crane abundance and crop loss. Our question is, how do these groups come together to alleviate the concerns that these beautiful birds present? Not only are cranes beautiful, but they also carry a lot of significance to Indigenous peoples in this area. I'm welcoming Chief Dean Sayers. So today I'm joined with Chief Dean Sayers of Batchewana First Nation of Ojibways, and their traditional lands run along the eastern shore of Lake Superior, from Batchewana Bay to Whitefish Island in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, which is where I'm currently joining you from today here in Sault Ste. Marie. So thank you, Chief Sayers, for taking the time out of what would be a busy schedule to speak with me today.
Let me again, David. My Anishinaabe name is Ogaman Nebanagojing Guyakasit, and I'm from the Crane clan, and I'm from Baoting here.
Before I wanted to dive into the impacts of cranes that we're seeing in our region, I thought it'd be valuable to take a step back to understand what Indigenous peoples see as the impacts of this special bird. And I don't think people may know that the people of the Crane clan or Dotem have a significant history and present role in Bawating. So are you able to just share maybe any stories about the Crane's significance to this place?
Well, the crane is really prominent in this area. I think Gaudet and Gaudet Anishinaabe, all the elders that have kept some of these thoughts alive through our oral traditions, including the incorporation of ceremony into how we keep alive a lot of our understandings. The intricate confines of a lot of our teachings are captured within ceremony and song and stories. And I do my best to capture the essence of those things as we refer to on the ground types of narratives that we try to periodically share to provide insight not only for our people, but for anybody that may be on our lands now. And it's really important for us to be able to do that, because what we end up doing when we share the Indigenous worldview with different audiences, that we are able to refresh, revive, rekindle some of those original instructions, original perspectives that came with the evolution that got us to where we are today. And that included our relationship with the crane. There's a whole bunch of cranes. I'm crane. More specifically, what my family has told me, that we're blue heron, and we are from Baoting. We frequented this area along with our relatives, the Sandhill cranes and the white cranes and the variances. Where I live, there's maybe 50 or more of the blue heron that live across the road from me in the bush. And you can hear them all the time. And they make this really loud noise. And if you don't know what they are, you wonder what that is. It captures your attention. And they make a god-awful noise. But that's their gift. That's part of what their responsibility is for us to take note of. A lot of times they will provide the warning to the rest of creation when there's something we need to be conscious of. And that's the sound that they make. And it causes you to look, and it causes you to take inventory and think. As human beings, we had forgotten our original instructions. So the animals, they all decided that they would help us, and because they needed our support, because that was part of our original responsibilities, was to help all of creation. So the animals befriended us, including the crane, the bear, the turtle, the wolf, the eagle, the marten, and many other animals, fish, the neme or the sturgeon, and other species, other animals. They all decided to share with us and help us remember what our original instructions might have been. We're human, but we also have some of the crane attributes and how we live and how we relate to the rest of our people, how we relate to all of the environment. And hence we became the chieftainship clan, because our voices would be heard, and we were always reflective of and conscious of warnings and what was coming to our people and being aware. And we became the chieftainship clan for the external, to look after anything that may be on the horizon. And it was the crane that in the central Great Lakes that chose for my people, the Batchewana and Anishinaabe, the Batchewana people. We chose land in proximity to Lake Superior. And the crane flew around this area and chose this area and communicated that we would accept the responsibility and send that word back to the Creator that we look after this area with the guidance and the support of the cranes. And the cranes have been prominent in this area ever since.
Here's Chris Sharp with Environment and Climate Change Canada who for the last number of years has been researching cranes in the north and their movements and impacts on agriculture. We asked him about the unique attributes of cranes and their history in the area. With Chris, we're going to be talking just about the impacts of cranes that he's observing through a project called the Sandhill Crane Movements and Agricultural Conflicts Project. And so, Chris, you've been visiting parts of Northern Ontario to understand the movements of cranes and their impacts. Maybe you could just start by giving us a picture of some of the attributes of the Sandhill crane in this eastern population, what makes them unique.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks, David. So one thing I'd like to point out is that there are two populations of Sandhill cranes in Ontario. The mid-continent population, which breeds in the Hudson Bay or James Bay lowlands, so further north in Ontario, and then migrates quickly through northwestern Ontario and then down into the central U.S., Manitoba and the central U.S. And then you have the eastern population, which you mentioned. The eastern population is generally thought to breed in more southern latitudes in Ontario, Quebec, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But through the work, some of the locational data we're getting back, there's evidence that some of these birds are breeding further north than we previously expected, especially on the Quebec side of James Bay. The reason I bring up the two different populations, the mid-continent population is approximately 1 million birds, and that breeding range extends from Hudson Bay all the way to Alaska. So a much larger population compared to the eastern population, which is only about 100,000 birds. That mid-continent population is hunted in the Canadian prairies as well as through its staging and wintering areas, whereas the eastern population currently is only hunted in a couple U.S. states.
Okay. So maybe we could just get into talking about the project. So what was the purpose of this project going into it?
The motivation for this research, we've seen a pretty dramatic range expansion and increase in abundance of the eastern population sandhill cranes in Ontario and Quebec. And with that increase in range and abundance, we've seen increased conflicts between agricultural producers and these cranes.
Mm-hmm. And it's only been a few years, but could you just speak to some of the movements you've seen and to the extent of the damage that is being caused from your observations so far?
Yeah, so from earlier work before this project and talking to producers, we found that most of the damage in Ontario occurs in agricultural areas on the fringe of the boreal forest. And it typically involves 3 crop types. So corn, cereals, namely barley, wheat, and oats, and then potatoes. So corn is vulnerable to damage from the time it's seeded until the plant reaches about 5 to 6 inches high. So during this period, the cranes will pull up the plant and clip off the seed at the bottom. And they're remarkably efficient at this, even finding the seed before there's even any growth. So there's no real evidence that the seed's there, and they go and probe and pick up the seed. The cereals are vulnerable pre-harvest, especially if harvest is delayed for whatever reason. If it was late into the ground or it's been wet in August and they can't get the crop off. And it's really vulnerable then because the cranes start to move into the agricultural areas and congregate in large numbers. Therefore, they can do more damage. And then the damage to the potatoes also occurs pre-harvest, but especially after the green portion of the plant has been top killed in preparation for harvest. So a lot of the damage on the Highway 17 corridor relates to corn. Along the Highway 11 corridor and Western Quebec, it's largely cereal crops. And then there's only a handful of producers of potato producers in Northern Ontario that have concerns with cranes, the monetary losses in this crop is the greatest given the high value of the crop. a couple of sort of patterns that we're seeing with our preliminary data is that different farms have different risks and different crops have different risks. So the location of farms in relation to other landscape features such as large wetlands or where the crop is grown what type of crop is grown seems to dictate the relative risk. For example, farms on the edge of a continuous forest that provides suitable roosting habitat is likely at a greater risk for conflict. And then a field of barley seems to be at greater risk of damage than, say, oats or hay, for example, all other things being equal. One other kind of interesting thing we're seeing is that non-breeding cranes cover a lot of area. And it's not clear really what they're doing when they're covering this area, if they're looking for mates or just prospecting for future breeding habitat. But they're covering a lot of ground, hundreds of kilometers over a couple week period, and with seemingly no rhyme or reason where they're headed. Since non-breeding cranes aren't tied to a territory, we think that they may be disproportionate. There's a disproportionate opportunity for them to become involved in agricultural conflicts. And this is especially true when discussing the damage with the corn in the spring, because the breeding cranes are typically nesting on a wetland somewhere far from cornfields, so that they've got other things to worry about.
So could you just speak to maybe what farmers are observing around the population, and in some ways how it may be somewhat deceiving of the sheer numbers of cranes that there actually are?
Yeah, so regarding abundance, there's definitely been an expansion of the population in Ontario and Quebec over the last few decades, both in absolute numbers as well as where they occur. This isn't a new thing. Cranes have been on the Ontario landscape for a long, long time, longer than people have been. It's really a recolonization of Eastern Canada for sandhill cranes. One thing that's difficult for some producers to appreciate is that where cranes congregate, they can be there in really large numbers. So a farmer might look out his window and see hundreds or thousands of cranes every day. But outside of these key areas, most people really never see a crane. So this results in some people thinking that there's way more cranes on the landscape than there actually is. So the last kind of comprehensive survey that we conducted in Ontario was in 2017, when we observed this is a minimum count of 14 to 15,000 cranes. So undoubtedly we missed some, but it's not like there's hundreds of thousands of cranes in the province. And so just to put that into comparison, there's roughly 100,000 breeding pairs of Canada geese just in southern Ontario. So compared to some of these other species, they're not nearly as abundant. And their distribution on the landscape is much more clustered than many other species that we frequently think about.
Especially in this area. Yeah. Like, where I am in Algoma. And that's why it's like we have a lot of crane clan in this area, right? So it just kind of like, well, maybe this was like a highway for cranes for a long time, right? Yeah. And it just had shifted over time.
If you look at the Breeding Bird Atlas, which is probably our best documentation of the increased range. So we've done every 20 years, they do a Breeding Bird Atlas that looks at changes in distribution and abundance. And Manitoulin for Ontario is the epicenter of sandhill cranes. Manitoulin and the James Bay, Hudson Bay coast. But you can see the cranes radiating out from Manitoulin. And probably overhunting a few hundred years ago was a major thing for sandhill cranes. They were a big bird, lots of meat, and maybe even taking of eggs. And then clearing of forest and wetland habitat, draining of wetlands would have been a negative thing for sandhill cranes. But then agriculture now with waste grain on the landscape we've created a smorgasbord for cranes. And so that's why we're kind of seeing some species that are able to take advantage of how humans have modified the landscape thrive, while others aren't doing as well.
Here is Justin Gaudet with Valley Growers Farm in Sudbury, who knows the impact of cranes firsthand as his potato crop has been hard hit by cranes. You may not realize, but Sudbury produces a significant amount of potatoes. When a meteor hit Sudbury over 1 billion years ago, not only did it lead to mineral exploration, but it also had an impact on the area's agricultural capacity to provide mineral-rich sandy soil. There's over 15 million potatoes grown each year in Sudbury, and Justin and his team of over 40 employees at Valley Growers grow 500 acres of potatoes a year and sell them across Ontario. So Justin, just tell me a bit more about Valley Growers and how you got into it.
So Valley Growers is a family farm. We've been growing potatoes in this region for about 5 generations now. We grow roughly about 15 million pounds of potatoes a year, along with a variety of different cover crops and cash crops such as oats, fall rye. We do some mustard and all sorts of different crops like that. So myself, I've been farming since about 2010. It was my grandfather that originally started Valley Growers itself. So I've been farming since 2010. I used to do just the springs and the summers between my post-secondary studies and stuff like that. And then about 3 years ago, the opportunity to take over the farm came up. So I decided to change my career path and jump into full-time farming, and it's been great ever since.
That's great. A lot of people don't really think about potato growing when they think of Sudbury. And I'm sure you get sick of hearing that you're mining potatoes. But just tell me a bit more about that history with your family, of how long that kind of goes back to and the history in the area.
Yeah, so it goes back a ways actually, and a lot of people actually that we buy farming equipment from can't believe that we're in Sudbury because they think it's just a mining community. But out here in the valley, it's actually really good potato country, really nice soils, and very flat, so not very hilly as some of the southern communities see it. So yeah, before there used to be actually around 4,500 acres of potatoes grown in the valley, and now we're down to about 900, which we grow 500 of those. So it dates back fairly far back. Yeah, so we could grow some good potatoes up here, I guess.
Great. So could you just tell me what's been the extent of the Sandhill crane impacts on your farm over the last few years?
So the Sandhill cranes have been quite an issue to deal with. It seems it gets worse and worse over the years. But they cause a lot of damage to the potatoes. They cause a lot more work for the farmers to try to mitigate and to find different solutions on how to deal with them. They also require us to have more employees to deal with picking out the bad potatoes that the cranes are damaging. In general, they've been causing a lot more work for us, that's for sure.
So when you speak of more work, that's kind of going from field to field to scare them off, that type of extra work?
So it starts back with trying to research different ways that different farmers are finding different solutions to try to mitigate the sandhill crane damages from different regions. So it starts with research, finding ways, and then using those ways to try to get rid of them, such as planting different crops and cover crops and lure crops to try to get them into those fields instead of the potato fields, and then paying people to scare the birds out of the fields, and then to pay extra people to remove all the damaged potatoes before going into storages. So there's a lot of additional costs there for sure.
Okay. And how many potatoes have been lost in terms of number of acres a year or pounds of potatoes a year? What does that mean for your bottom line, essentially?
So I would say that we need to throw out roughly between 250 to 500,000 pounds of potatoes a year due to the crane damage. The loss of potatoes is not only financial impacts in potato wise kind of thing. Like I was saying too, like during harvest season, I need to have a lot of additional staff to try to remove all these potatoes. And some fields we're throwing out more potatoes that are actually going into the storages. So you're throwing out 50% plus. The cranes are they tend to go to the same regions. So the same fields. Like I have some fields that'll never get touched. They don't go in them. And then I have other fields that's the ones that they go after. So that's what we've been noticing is they stick to the same regions and the same fields. So I have to change my harvest schedule, not based on maturity of the crop, but based on which fields are going to get hit hardest, because the longer I leave them in there, every day more damages occur. So I'm harvesting fields based on cranes and not based on which field is ready to be harvested kind of thing. So it affects us that way. So yeah, so the staff will throw out 50%. So they're working extremely hard than they'd have to if you were in a nice field. And the other problem is that the cranes, they pick at the potatoes that are in the row. When the potato is buried, I guess they can stick their beak in there and they can pick out, like eat some of the potatoes. And then once the potato gets stuck on their beak, they'll pull it out of the ground and they drop it between the rows. And in our region, we often have early frosts. So all those potatoes that are between the rows often will get frozen before we harvest the fields. So now if one of those potatoes gets by the grading crew and gets put into your storage, then it could cause a huge financial problem by affecting other good potatoes that are in storage. It's very hard to put a number on how much potatoes are lost per year. If the grading crew is doing a really good job, then we should not see any potatoes in the storages, so that wouldn't cause any losses in the storage. But if, and it, nobody's perfect, if they do miss them and it causes other good potatoes to decay in the storages, then you have huge amounts of potatoes that can be thrown away due to the cranes.
I've heard that Sandhill cranes are very smart and they can even spot the same trucks that are coming to scare them away. Have you seen that same kind of activity with some of the farm workers that you work with?
Absolutely. So they will recognize your truck at the starting of the year. You will drive right next to them and they won't be scared. And then as you scare them off and off and off, as soon as that truck will come into the field, they will fly away. You go back to the farm and you grab a different colored truck and go in the field, they're not as scared. They're super, super intelligent birds.
Chief Sayers Chris Sharp and Justin Gaudet shared some excellent insight into the history of Sandhill cranes and the issues they present in Northern Ontario. Having heard their perspectives, we recognize that to mitigate crane damage, farmers may need to experiment with a variety of strategies to figure out what works to keep the cranes out of their crops. On the next episode of the Packsack Project, we are bringing back our three guests to ask them about their intentions and opinions on tackling the Sandhill crane damage in the north.
We all have the ability to work with the eco spirit to make sure that our voice is heard. So the eco spirit helps with making sure that all of creation hears whatever they need to hear, similar to the relationship that the crane still uses with that relationship with the echo. So the crane uses echo spirit to work with, and you'll hear that. If you listen close, you'll hear the crane continue to be aware of spirit and work with spirit and use spirit to be able to make sure everybody hears and listens in all of creation.
If you have any questions, we would be happy to answer them on our program. We are on Facebook and Instagram at the Packsack Project, and you can also find us on Twitter at the Packsack Pod. If you're not on social media, you can email us at thepacksackproject@gmail.com. To find more episodes, head to nordicinstitute.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcast. Your participation and support means a lot to us, so thank you for following us online. Thank you to FedNor, Nordic Institute, Algoma University, and the Sault Ste. Marie Innovation Center for making this podcast possible and allowing us to share stories of resilience in our northern communities.